To excel in our study of the Old Testament, we need to become aware of three different realities, or worlds, regarding the text. The world of the text, the world behind the text, and the world in front of the text. While all three of these worlds are important and come into play in the interpretation of texts, it is very important that we understand how these worlds are distinct from one another. The world of the text is simply the text itself. Even where the text may relate to external history, it is a world that is contained within the text and reconstructed in our imaginations. The Abraham stories, as they are told in Genesis 12 through 25, are contained within the world of the text. The world behind the text refers to the external events of objective history which a text may purport to describe. If Abraham was a real historical character, whatever events actually happened to him that may stand behind the Abraham stories in Genesis took place in the world behind the text. These events may be identical to what we read in the text, but then again they may not. Even if they are, the distinction is important. Finally, the world in front of the text is the world of the reader and the images, assumptions, values, and knowledge that the reader brings to the text. This includes not just one individual reader, meaning you or me, but a consideration of readers throughout history, which is the focus of reception history studies, and even the theoretical world of the implied reader, the hypothetical ideal reader discerned from the text. We can actually talk then about multiple worlds in front of the text. The world in front of the text is also the most malleable of the three worlds. It can be changed at will when a reader chooses to adopt different assumptions or learn something new. The three worlds concept is important in the study of the Old Testament for several reasons. First, it helps us speak with precision about biblical history. When talking about the relationship between the Bible and history, it's useful to make conceptual distinctions between the inner consistency of the text on the one hand and the real people and events that the text may refer to on the other hand, even if we presume a high degree of verisimilitude between the worlds. When we conflate the text with the events behind the text, it can lead to confusion. Second, it helps us think clearly about how the text produces meaning. There's an ongoing philosophical discussion about where the meaning of texts comes from. Even if that meaning is a collaborative product of author, text, and reader, we still need to distinguish all three parts of the conversation. Third, it helps us to become self-aware readers. Self-awareness is a necessary component of careful reading. The effect of a text on a reader is the product of an interaction between the text on the one hand and the assumptions, values, and linguistic skills of the reader on the other hand. So it's vital that the reader learn to become aware of those assumptions. To become aware of oneself in relation to a text is to become aware of the differences and similarities between the world in front of the text, the reader, and the world of the text itself. Fourth, it helps us avoid logical sloppiness. It's not uncommon to see even biblical scholars failing to make a conceptual distinction between the world behind the text, here meaning the author or point in time of a text's composition, and the world in front of the text in the form of a hypothetical reading community. A conflation of these two worlds is often what sits behind many attempts to assign a date to various biblical texts. For example, a biblical scholar may identify a moment in history when a given biblical text might have been especially relevant, for example, the Babylonian exile or the reign of Josiah. This is then taken as conclusive evidence that the text was composed in response to this moment in history. But this is a logical fallacy akin to cum hoc ergo propter hoc, or coincidence means consequence. An observation of special readerly relevance may be a part of an argument for dating a text, but because it is an argument that conflates the worlds of the author and of the reader, it should not be used as an all-sufficient or even a primary argument. Classic texts are classics because they have enduring relevance that extends well beyond their original authorial context. As careful readers of any text, especially biblical texts, we need to stay aware of the theoretical differences between these worlds, the interplay of these worlds, and the questions that are relevant to each world. That being said, the first task, and in my opinion the end goal of the biblical interpreter, is the analysis of the world of the text itself. It is not the only task, obviously, but it has operational priority. It must come first procedurally, because it is the task that gives shape and meaning to the analyses of the worlds behind and in front of the text. I care about the history behind the text and the dynamic interplay between reader and text precisely because I care about understanding the meaning of the text as perfectly as possible. It is also true, however, that while it is important to keep these three worlds conceptually distinct, they nevertheless work together symbiotically. In fact, in my opinion, the best and most vibrant interpretation of the biblical text happens at that moment when all three worlds come together and speak as one. This is what Karl Barth talks about in the foreword to the second edition of his commentary on the Epistle to the Romans when he says this: "By genuine understanding and interpretation, I mean that creative energy which Luther exercised with intuitive certainty in his exegesis, which underlies the systematic interpretation of Calvin, and which is at least attempted by such modern writers as Hohmann, J.T. Beck, Godet, and Schlatter. For example, place the work of Jülicher side by side with that of Calvin. How energetically Calvin, having first established what stands in the text, sets himself to rethink the whole material and to wrestle with it, till the walls which separate the 16th century from the first become transparent. Paul speaks, and the man of the 16th century hears." The conversation between the original record and the reader moves round the subject matter until a distinction between yesterday and today becomes impossible. This is not to say that the distinction collapses entirely, but that all three worlds, like three lenses, come together into mutual focus to point to something beyond any one of them, to connect not only reader to author, but more importantly, believer to God. So as we proceed in this course, keep in mind these three concepts: the world of the text, the world behind the text, and the world in front of the text, and try to observe how these worlds interact with one another in our discussion of the biblical texts and in your own reading of those texts.